The rain drummed relentlessly against the window pane, casting a grey pall over the streets of New Orleans. Inside a cramped apartment in Marigny, Lisa Langston sat motionless at the small kitchen table, staring at the object resting in her palm. The dim light from the overhead bulb reflected off the delicate gold band, the tiny diamond glinting faintly. Her wedding ring, once a symbol of eternal love, now felt like a shackle tied to a past she'd worked so hard to leave behind. In the corner of the room, Felix, her youngest, hummed softly to himself as he played with a battered toy truck. His curly hair bounced with every animated movement, and his laughter occasionally broke the somber silence. Nearby, Anna, her 10-year-old daughter, sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling intently in her sketchpad. Lisa's chest tightened as she watched them. They deserved so much more than she could give them, a life free from constant worry, where laughter wasn't tinged with uncertainty. The rain continued its steady rhythm as her thoughts spiraled. Tonight's dinner would be simple: half a loaf of stale bread, a can of soup, and a few bruised apples she'd managed to buy with the last few dollars in her wallet. It wouldn't be enough to fill their stomachs, but it would have to do. Lisa clenched the ring tighter, the cool metal pressing against her palm. She had resisted this moment for months, holding on to the piece of jewelry as if it were a lifeline. It was the last remnant of the life she'd once envisioned, a life with Finn Calloway, her ex-husband, and their shared dreams of building a family together. But Finn's ambition had driven him further from them, and his promises had dissolved into lonely nights and unanswered questions. The day she walked away from him with her children in tow was the day she vowed never to rely on anyone else again. But now, as the bills piled higher and the fridge grew emptier, she knew the time had come. The ring was just an object, she told herself, though her heart twisted with every beat. It wasn't love or security. It wouldn't feed her children or pay the rent. "Mama," Felix called out, his voice sweet and curious. "When's dinner?" Lisa blinked away the tears threatening to fall. She forced a smile, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "Soon, baby. Mama's just thinking for a moment." He nodded, satisfied, and returned to his truck. Lisa looked over at Anna, who had paused her drawing to watch her mother. The girl's sharp brown eyes, so much like her father's, were filled with quiet understanding. Anna always saw more than Lisa wanted her to. Pushing herself to her feet, Lisa grabbed her coat and slipped the ring into the pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than it should, as though the memories it carried had solidified into something tangible. "I'll be back in a bit," she said, keeping her tone casual. "Mrs. Jenkins is just across the hall if you need anything." "Where are you going?" Anna asked, her voice cautious. Lisa hesitated. "Just to run an errand. Don't worry, okay?" Anna nodded slowly, though her expression betrayed her doubt. Lisa kissed Felix on the head and squeezed Anna's shoulder before stepping out into the rain-soaked evening. The rain was colder than she'd expected, soaking through Lisa's thin jacket as she made her way down the uneven sidewalk. Streetlights flickered against the darkened sky, casting fractured pools of light on the glistening pavement. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding louder than the rain in her ears. She had walked these streets countless times before, but tonight the familiar path felt daunting, like walking a tightrope over an abyss. The pawnshop stood at the corner of a narrow street, its neon sign flickering, "Buy, Sell, Trade," in garish red letters. Lisa hesitated outside, staring at the shop through the rain-streaked window. Inside, shelves lined with guitars, electronics, and tarnished jewelry spoke of countless other lives and their quiet, desperate decisions. She swallowed hard, feeling her resolve waver, but then the image of Felix's innocent face flashed in her mind. She couldn't let her pride outweigh her children's needs. Pushing the door open, Lisa was greeted by the faint hum of an old radio and the metallic scent of dust and despair. Behind the counter stood Arthur Green, a grey-haired man with kind eyes that belied his business's cold practicality. He looked up from the watch he was examining and offered her a small nod. "Evening, miss," Arthur said, his gravelly voice softened by familiarity. She had been here before, once to sell an old bracelet and another time to pawn a camera she'd never retrieved. She hated that he recognized her. Lisa managed a weak smile, pulling the ring from her pocket. Her hand trembled as she placed it on the counter. "I'd like to sell this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Arthur adjusted his glasses and picked up the ring, turning it under the light. His practiced fingers traced its delicate engravings, and he let out a low hum. "It's a nice piece," he said. "Simple but classic. You sure you want to part with it?" Lisa hesitated, her throat tightening. She wanted to say no, to snatch the ring back and walk out the door, but the weight of her situation crushed that impulse. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady now. "I'm sure." Arthur gave her a long look before nodding. He stepped into the back room briefly and returned with a small envelope of cash. "I can give you this much," he said, sliding it across the counter. "I know it's worth more, but this is what I can offer for resale." Lisa's eyes dropped to the envelope. It wasn't much, barely enough for a week's groceries, but it was something. She nodded, blinking rapidly to fight the tears welling in her eyes. "That's fine," she said, forcing herself not to think about the value it had once held in her heart. Arthur placed the ring in a small pouch, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes things come back to us in unexpected ways," he said, his words carrying a strange weight. Lisa wasn't sure if he was offering wisdom or consolation, but she couldn't bear to linger and find out. "Thank you," she murmured, clutching the envelope and hurrying out into the rain. The cold hit her like a slap, but the weight in her pocket was lighter now, the guilt of what she'd done mingling with a strange, hollow relief. As she walked back toward the apartment, her thoughts churned. What would Anna think if she knew? Would Felix ever understand the sacrifices she'd made? She paused under the awning of a closed diner, gripping the envelope tightly. For a brief moment, she thought about turning back, but the reality of her situation pushed her forward. She couldn't afford to let sentimentality cloud her judgment, not when her children depended on her. What Lisa didn't know was that her decision had already set something else into motion. Back at the pawnshop, Arthur carefully packed the ring into a padded envelope. His hands moved with precision as he addressed it to a jeweler he'd worked with for decades. The ring was just another item in his inventory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it carried a story waiting to be told. Lisa arrived home just as the rain began to let up, the sound of Felix and Anna laughing softly through the thin apartment door. She paused before stepping inside, her heart aching with both love and regret. Tomorrow she would figure out what to do next. For tonight, she would focus on making sure her children went to bed with full stomachs and warm smiles. But as she opened the door and took in their eager faces, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the past was far from over. The dim light inside the pawnshop felt colder than the rain Lisa had just escaped. She hesitated near the counter, her eyes scanning the shelves filled with discarded belongings, guitars with missing strings, cameras with cracked lenses, and tarnished jewelry that once carried significance. Each item seemed to carry its own story of desperation, and the realization that hers was now among them sent a shiver down her spine. Arthur Green, the shop's owner, glanced up from the old radio he was tinkering with. His sharp eyes softened when they landed on Lisa. He remembered her, not by name, but by the tired determination in her expression, a look he'd seen far too often. "Evening, ma'am," Arthur said, wiping his hands on a rag. "How can I help you tonight?" Lisa approached the counter slowly, her hand tightening around the small envelope in her pocket. She took out the ring and placed it on the worn glass countertop, her fingers trembling as if resisting the finality of the gesture. "I need to sell this," she said, her voice barely audible. Arthur picked up the ring with practiced care, holding it under the light. He adjusted his glasses and examined it, turning it this way and that. "It's a beautiful piece," he said after a moment. "Simple, classic, platinum band, small but good quality diamond." He set it down gently, giving Lisa a measured look. "You sure you want to part with it?" Lisa's lips tightened, and she nodded. "Yes," she said firmly, though every fiber of her being wanted to grab it back and run. "I'm sure." Arthur didn't press her further. He'd learned long ago not to ask too many questions when people came in with pieces like this. Wedding rings, family heirlooms, keepsakes that clearly meant more than their material value. Some stories weren't his to know. "All right," he said, his voice softening. "Let me see what I can offer." He pulled out a small scale and weighed the ring, his movements precise and methodical. Lisa watched him with a lump in her throat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She tried to tell herself it was just a transaction, just an object. But the hollow ache in her chest made it impossible to believe her own lie. Arthur jotted down some numbers on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter. The amount was painfully low, barely enough to cover groceries for the week, but Lisa knew better than to argue. Pawnshops didn't deal in sentiment, only value. "This is the best I can do," Arthur said, his tone apologetic. "The market for these things isn't what it used to be." "It's fine," Lisa said quickly, not trusting herself to say more. She reached for the envelope of cash he handed her, her fingers brushing against his for a moment. His eyes met hers, and she thought she saw something like understanding in them, though he didn't say a word. Arthur placed the ring in a small velvet pouch and set it aside. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "things have a way of finding their way back to us. You never know." Lisa didn't respond. She couldn't. The knot in her throat was too tight, and the weight of what she'd done felt too heavy. She clutched the envelope of cash and turned to leave, the little bell above the door jangling as she stepped back into the rain. The rain greeted Lisa like an unwelcome companion as she stepped out of the pawnshop and onto the slick sidewalk. The cash in her pocket felt both heavier and lighter than it should have, a strange contradiction that mirrored the turmoil in her chest. She adjusted her hood against the cold drizzle and started back toward her apartment, her thoughts a tangled mess of regret and resolve. She replayed Arthur's words in her mind. Things have a way of finding their way back to us. Was it just a hollow platitude? Something he said to ease the guilt of people like her who left pieces of themselves on his counter? Or was there something prophetic in his tone? Lisa shook her head. She didn't have the luxury of dwelling on what-ifs or sentimental notions. Her kids needed food tonight, not hope. As she walked past shuttered storefronts and dimly lit street corners, the memories attached to that ring followed her like shadows. She remembered the day Finn had slipped it onto her finger, his eyes filled with promises she'd believed in wholeheartedly. Back then, they'd imagined a future filled with success and happiness, a life where they would raise a family in comfort, far from the struggles they'd both endured growing up. But dreams didn't pay the bills, and ambition, as it turned out, didn't guarantee loyalty. Finn had chosen his career, his relentless climb to the top, over the life they'd built together. The ache of that realization still lingered, though she rarely allowed herself to dwell on it. Tonight, however, the memories clawed their way to the surface, as raw and unrelenting as the rain. Lost in thought, Lisa didn't notice the figure standing under the awning of a nearby cafe until she was nearly past him. He was tall, with a coat pulled tightly around him and a hood obscuring most of his face. She glanced at him briefly, her heart skipping a beat, when his head turned slightly, as if watching her. The brief moment of unease passed when he didn't move or say anything, and she quickened her pace. By the time Lisa reached her apartment building, the rain had soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She paused in the narrow hallway outside her door, listening to the muffled laughter of Felix and Anna from within. Their giggles carried through the thin walls, a bittersweet melody that made her chest tighten. She took a moment to collect herself, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, and forced a smile before stepping inside. "Mama!" Felix cried, running up to her with his arms outstretched. He wrapped himself around her legs, his tiny hands warm against the cold fabric of her jeans. "Hey, sweetheart," Lisa said, scooping him up and kissing the top of his curly head. She turned to Anna, who sat cross-legged on the floor, her sketchpad still in hand. "What have you two been up to?" "Felix was helping me draw," Anna said, holding up a page covered in colourful stick figures. "This one's you and that's me and Felix, see? We're holding hands." Lisa's heart clenched at the sight. In Anna's drawing, they were all smiling, surrounded by flowers and sunshine. No rain, no worries, just a perfect world crafted by the hands of a 10-year-old. "It's beautiful, Anna," Lisa said softly, stroking her daughter's cheek. "I'll hang it up on the fridge." Anna's gaze lingered on her mother, her sharp eyes filled with questions she didn't ask. Lisa knew Anna saw more than she let on, her quiet understanding far beyond her years. It was a reminder of just how much the girl had grown up too fast, an unspoken burden of the life they'd been forced to lead. Lisa busied herself preparing dinner, the meager contents of her grocery bag spread across the counter. She heated a can of soup, sliced the stale bread, and arranged the bruised apples on a small plate. It wasn't much, but she made it look like a feast, adding an extra slice of bread to each plate, as if abundance could be faked with presentation. "Dinner's ready," she called, and the children eagerly gathered at the table. As they ate, Lisa found herself smiling despite the storm inside her. Felix chattered about his truck, and Anna shared a story about her teacher complimenting her artwork. For a brief moment, the weight of her choices lifted, replaced by the simple joy of being with her children. But as Lisa cleaned up after dinner and tucked Felix into bed, her thoughts returned to the pawnshop. Somewhere out there, her wedding ring was no longer hers, its story now a mystery she would never solve. Or so she thought. Back at the pawnshop, Arthur Green sat at his desk, the velvet pouch containing Lisa's ring resting in front of him. He turned it over in his hands, his expression contemplative. He'd seen countless pieces of jewelry pass through his shop over the years, but something about this ring lingered in his mind. After a moment's hesitation, he reached for his ledger and began jotting down details: weight, material, appraisal value. Then he carefully packaged the ring in a padded envelope addressed to Harrison Jewelers in New York City. Arthur had worked with the jeweler for decades, and they'd always had an unspoken agreement. If anything particularly unusual came through, it was worth passing along. Little did Arthur know, the man receiving the envelope would recognize the ring immediately, setting off a chain of events Lisa could never have foreseen. Back in her apartment, Lisa sat alone in the dim light of the kitchen, her thoughts heavy with the past and the uncertainty of the future. As the rain softened outside, she whispered to herself, "We'll get through this. We always do." What she didn't know was that her past was already beginning to catch up with her. Finn Calloway sat at the edge of his mahogany desk, the lights of New York City glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. In his hands was a velvet pouch, its weight disproportionately heavy for such a small object. He untied the string with a deliberate slowness, his usually steady hands betraying a faint tremor. When the pouch fell open, the familiar glint of platinum and diamond caught the light. The wedding ring was as pristine as the day he had bought it nearly 12 years ago. It had been a simple design, understated yet elegant, exactly what Lisa had wanted. Finn let out a shallow breath as he stared at the ring, memories rushing in like an unstoppable tide. He remembered the day he had slipped it onto her finger, the warmth in her smile and the hope in her eyes. Back then, he had thought they could conquer anything together. But that hope had dissolved into years of missed anniversaries, strained conversations, and unspoken resentment. His ambitions, which he had always framed as being for their future, had slowly but surely become walls that separated them. By the time he realized how far apart they had grown, it was too late. Lisa had packed up her life and their children, leaving behind nothing but silence. Finn clenched the ring tightly in his fist, guilt and regret tightening his chest. He had convinced himself that sending checks and staying out of their way was the best thing he could do for them, that they were better off without him. But holding the ring now, he wondered if he'd been lying to himself all along. Was it too late to fix what he'd broken? "Mr. Calloway," Clara's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. His assistant stood in the doorway, her usual polished demeanor tinged with hesitation. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but I noticed you've been staring at that for a while." Finn glanced up, startled, and placed the ring back into the pouch. "It's nothing," he said, his tone sharp but unconvincing. Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly not buying his dismissal. "That's not just nothing," she said, stepping into the office and crossing her arms. "You've been off all day. I don't mean to pry, but it's obvious whatever that is. It means something." Finn sighed, leaning back against the desk. He trusted Clara, even if he rarely let her see beyond the polished veneer of his public image. After a moment of hesitation, he handed her the pouch. Clara opened it, her sharp eyes softening as she took in the ring. "Lisa?" she asked, her voice gentle. Finn nodded. "It came in the mail this morning. A jeweler I used to work with in New Orleans sent it. Apparently it was sold at a pawn shop." Clara frowned, processing the information. "So she sold it?" she asked. "I guess so," Finn said, his voice heavy. He pushed off the desk and walked toward the window, staring out at the city below. "I don't know why, but it feels like a sign, like something I shouldn't ignore." "You think she's struggling?" Clara asked, her tone cautious but pointed. "I don't know," Finn admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if she is, and I've just been sitting here all this time, what kind of man does that make me?" Clara crossed the room and placed the ring on his desk. "It's never too late to do the right thing, Finn," she said. "But you can't half-ass it. If you're going to reach out, you need to be ready to face everything you left behind." Her words hung in the air as Finn turned back to the ring, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. "Book me a flight to New Orleans," he said finally. "As soon as possible." Clara didn't hesitate, pulling out her phone to make the arrangements. Finn remained by the window, his mind a swirl of conflicted emotions. He thought of Lisa, the quiet strength she had always carried, and the children he hadn't seen in years. He wondered if they'd even remember him, if they'd want to. The next morning, Finn stood at the private terminal of the airport, waiting for his jet to be prepared. The velvet pouch was still in his pocket, the weight of it grounding him like an anchor. As he boarded the plane, Clara handed him a folder with a detailed itinerary. "I added a list of local shelters and community programs in the area," she said, "in case you need leads." "Thanks," Finn replied, taking the folder but barely glancing at it. His thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the possibilities of what lay ahead. The flight was uneventful. though Finn couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. New Orleans had always been Lisa's city, a place that matched her vibrant spirit and unwavering determination. Returning here felt like stepping into her world, a world he had abandoned when his own priorities had overshadowed theirs. By the time the plane touched down, Finn's resolve had solidified. He stepped into the sticky warmth of the New Orleans air, his tailored suit already feeling out of place in the city's casual rhythm. A car was waiting to take him to the hotel, but Finn found himself asking the driver to detour through Marigny instead. As they wove through the narrow streets, Finn took in the colourful buildings and wrought iron balconies, each one steeped in history and charm. Memories of strolling through these very streets with Lisa came flooding back. Her laughter as she dragged him into a corner cafe, her eyes lighting up at the sound of a street performer's jazz tune. Back then, he had promised her a life filled with moments like those. How quickly he had let that promise slip away. The car stopped at a busy intersection, and Finn noticed a small pawn shop tucked between a laundromat and a diner. His chest tightened. This could be it, he thought. The place where Lisa had sold the ring. The thought of her walking into such a place, driven by desperation, made him feel sick. "Pull over," Finn said abruptly. The driver obliged, and Finn stepped out, taking a moment to gather himself before pushing the pawnshop door open. A bell jingled above him, and he was met with the faint hum of a radio and the sharp scent of old metal and dust. Behind the counter stood a grey-haired man with keen eyes who gave Finn a measured look. "Afternoon," the man said. "What can I do for you?" Finn pulled the pouch from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "This ring," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. "It was sold here recently. I need to know who brought it in." The pawnbroker studied him for a long moment before picking up the pouch and opening it. Recognition flickered in his expression. "You're asking about the woman who sold this?" "Yes," Finn said. "It's important." The man hesitated, as if weighing his options. "I don't usually give out that kind of information," he said finally. "Privacy and all." Finn's jaw tightened, but he softened his tone. "I understand. But this isn't just a transaction to me. The person who sold this ring. She's my ex-wife. I need to know if she's okay." The sincerity in Finn's voice seemed to break through the man's reservations. With a sigh, he pulled out a worn ledger and flipped through its pages. "She didn't give much detail," he said, scanning the entries. "Just said she needed the money for her kids. Looked like she hadn't had a decent meal in days." Finn's stomach twisted at the image. "Did she say where she was staying?" The man shook his head. "Only mentioned a shelter nearby. Might be a good place to start." Finn nodded, his resolve hardening. "Thank you," he said, slipping the ring back into his pocket. As he stepped outside, the humid air hit him like a wall, but the weight in his chest was far heavier. He climbed back into the car and directed the driver toward the address of the shelter Clara had included in her folder. He wasn't sure what he would say when he found Lisa. But one thing was clear. He couldn't turn back now. The afternoon sun filtered through the cracked blinds of the community shelter's main office, casting faint lines across the cluttered desk. Lisa stood by the open window, a slight breeze carrying the distant hum of traffic and the chatter of children playing in the courtyard. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, still damp from washing the lunch trays, and let her gaze drift to the street beyond. It had been a busy day, like most days here, but the rhythm of the shelter's routine was one of the few things that gave her peace. "Lisa, could you help me with this paperwork?" Rachel's voice carried from across the room, breaking her thoughts. The shelter's manager was seated at the desk, her dark curls pulled into a haphazard bun and her reading glasses perched precariously on the edge of her nose. Lisa nodded and crossed the room. "What's wrong with it?" "Just a few forms I need double-checked," Rachel said, sliding a stack of papers toward her. I swear, if one more donor sends us a form with typos, I'm going to lose it. Lisa smiled faintly, taking a seat and picking up a pen. As she scanned the documents, Rachel leaned back in her chair, studying her with an appraising look. "You've been quieter than usual today," Rachel said, her tone casual but probing. Lisa didn't look up. "Just tired," she replied, though they both knew it wasn't the full truth. Rachel hummed in acknowledgement, but didn't press further. Over the years, she had learned when to let Lisa keep her walls intact and when to push. Today wasn't the day for pushing. The bell above the shelter's front door jingled, signaling a new arrival. Rachel glanced at the clock. "That's odd," she muttered. "We're not expecting anyone until the evening shift." "I'll check," Lisa offered, rising from her chair and heading toward the entrance. As she stepped into the lobby, she froze. Finn stood just inside the door, his tall frame casting a shadow across the tiled floor. He looked out of place in his crisp shirt and tailored jacket, the polished shine of his shoes a stark contrast to the worn surroundings. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Lisa," he said finally, his voice low but unmistakable. Her breath caught, and a flood of emotions surged through her, shock, anger, and a pang of something she couldn't quite name. She crossed her arms, her expression hardening. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Finn said, stepping forward slightly. "I found out about the ring, about everything." Lisa's jaw tightened, her posture defensive. "You have no right to be here," she said sharply. "Whatever you think you're doing, just stop. We don't need your help." Finn held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm not here to make things harder for you," he said. I had to know if you were okay." "Well, now you know," Lisa snapped, her voice rising. "We're fine. We've been fine without you." Rachel appeared behind Lisa, her gaze darting between them. "Everything all right out here?" she asked, her tone cautious but firm. "This is Finn," Lisa said stiffly, not bothering to elaborate further. Rachel's brows lifted slightly, but she said nothing, simply crossing her arms as she waited for the tension to diffuse. Finn exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Look, I know I've made mistakes," he said, his voice quieter now, "but I'm not here to drag up the past. I just want to help." "We don't need your charity," Lisa shot back, her words laced with bitterness. Finn's face tightened, but he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "but if you change your mind, you know where to find me." Lisa didn't respond. She turned sharply on her heel and walked back into the office, her heart pounding as she struggled to push down the emotions threatening to surface. Rachel lingered in the lobby, studying Finn for a moment before speaking. "You'd better have a good reason for showing up here," she said, her tone steely. "Lisa's been through enough." "I know," Finn said, "and I don't blame her for shutting me out. But I'm not going anywhere." Rachel's expression softened slightly, though skepticism still lingered in her eyes. "You've got a lot to prove," she said, before heading back into the office and leaving Finn alone in the quiet lobby. Finn lingered in the shelter's lobby for a moment, taking in the stark surroundings. The walls were decorated with hand-drawn pictures and motivational posters, their bright colors contrasting sharply with the worn-out furniture. He felt out of place, as though his very presence disrupted the fragile harmony of the space. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to leave. His eyes drifted to the doorway Lisa had disappeared through, the weight of her words still heavy in the air. He hadn't expected a warm reception, not after everything, but the coldness in Lisa's voice stung more than he'd anticipated. Still, he told himself, he had come here for a reason, and walking away now would only confirm what Lisa already thought of him. He adjusted his tie, more out of habit than necessity, and made his way toward the main office. Rachel was the first to spot him again. She raised an eyebrow, her hands on her hips. You've got guts. I'll give you that, she said dryly. But persistence doesn't mean you'll get what you want. I'm not here to make things harder for her, Finn said, his tone steady but pleading. I just want to help. Rachel studied him for a long moment, as though trying to gauge the sincerity behind his words. You want to help? She asked finally, her voice laced with skepticism. Then prove it. We've got a delivery of supplies that needs sorting in the back. You can start there. Finn blinked, caught off guard by the suggestion. Sorting supplies? He repeated, unsure if she was serious. Rachel smirked, folding her arms. If you're serious about wanting to help, roll up your sleeves. Otherwise, the door's that way. Finn hesitated, then nodded. All right, he said, shrugging off his jacket and draping it over a nearby chair. He loosened his tie and followed Rachel to the back room, where boxes of donated goods were stacked high against the walls. Lisa was there, unpacking cans of food and stacking them neatly on a shelf. She froze when she saw Finn enter, her expression a mixture of surprise and frustration. What are you doing back here? She demanded. He volunteered, Rachel said, her tone deliberately neutral as she handed Finn a box cutter. I figured we could use an extra set of hands. Lisa's eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to her work, her movements sharper than necessary as she resumed unpacking. Finn picked up a box from the nearest stack and began opening it, the silence between them thick with tension. For several minutes, they worked side by side without speaking. The occasional clink of cans and rustle of cardboard were the only sounds in the room. Finn stole a glance at Lisa, noticing the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes and the tightness in her jaw. He wanted to say something, anything to break the ice, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate. Finally, it was Lisa who broke the silence, her voice low but firm. You don't have to do this, you know. Whatever you're trying to prove, it doesn't matter. Finn set down the box he was holding and turned to face her. It matters to me, he said simply. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to do better. For you. For the kids. Lisa shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. You think showing up here and unpacking a few boxes is going to fix everything? It's not that simple, Finn. I know it's not, Finn said, his voice steady despite the frustration building inside him. But I'm not here for a quick fix. I'm here because I want to be part of their lives again. And yours. Lisa froze, her hands gripping the edge of a shelf. For a moment her resolve wavered, the weight of his words pressing against the walls she had so carefully built, but the years of hurt and disappointment were too much to ignore. You don't get to just walk back into our lives like nothing happened, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. You don't know what it's been like for us. Then tell me, Finn said, stepping closer. Help me understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Lisa. I'm asking for a chance to make things right. Their eyes met, a charged silence stretching between them. Lisa opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when Rachel re-entered the room, carrying another box. The moment shattered, and Lisa turned away, her expression guarded once more. Rachel, sensing the tension, placed the box down and cleared her throat. Finn, if you're serious about helping, we could use someone to deliver some of these supplies to a few families across town. Finn nodded, grateful for the distraction. I'll do it. Lisa didn't protest, but as Finn gathered the supplies and headed out the door, she couldn't help but watch him go, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, doubt, and something she wasn't ready to name. Rachel placed a hand on Lisa's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to decide anything right now, she said, but maybe give him a chance to prove himself. Lisa sighed, the weight of the day pressing down on her. We'll see, she said quietly, though her heart remained guarded. Whatever Finn's intentions, she wasn't ready to let him back in. Not yet. But something about his determination left her wondering if, perhaps, he truly had changed. Felix's laughter echoed through the small playground, a bright, carefree sound that stood out against the chatter of the other children. He was crouched by the sandbox, carefully piling damp sand into a bucket before flipping it over to reveal a lopsided tower. His concentration was intense, his tongue sticking out slightly as he worked, while a small group of kids nearby watched him with curiosity. Finn stood a few feet away, leaning awkwardly against the low fence that bordered the playground. He felt out of place, his tailored clothes and polished shoes contrasting with the casual, lived-in atmosphere of the community space. But he couldn't bring himself to leave. Watching Felix play was like seeing a piece of himself that he hadn't realized was missing. Felix, completely absorbed in his creation, didn't notice Finn at first. It wasn't until one of the kids called out, "Hey, Felix, who's that guy?" that he looked up. His bright blue eyes, so much like Lisa's, landed on Finn, and for a moment there was nothing but confusion on his face. Finn stepped forward cautiously, his heart pounding. "Hi, Felix," he said softly, crouching slightly to meet the boy's gaze. I'm Finn." Your dad." Felix blinked, his small hands clutching the plastic bucket. "My dad?" he echoed, his voice uncertain but curious. Finn nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I know it's been a long time, but I wanted to see you. I wanted to get to know you." Felix tilted his head, his expression shifting from confusion to cautious interest. "Mama says you live far away," he said matter-of-factly. "She said you're busy." Finn felt a pang of guilt, but forced a small smile. "I've been busy, but I'm here now," he said. "And I'd really like to spend some time with you, if that's okay." Felix studied him for a moment, then pointed to the sandbox. "Do you know how to build a castle?" Finn let out a soft laugh, relief washing over him. "I think I can figure it out," he said, stepping closer. He knelt beside Felix, who immediately handed him a small shovel. For the next several minutes, Finn followed Felix's instructions, carefully piling sand into buckets and placing them side by side. Felix's shyness began to fade, replaced by the easy chatter of a child eager to share his world. He explained his strategy for building the strongest castle ever, his little hands flying as he demonstrated. "You have to make the walls thick," Felix said seriously, "so they don't fall down when it rains." Finn nodded, his chest tightening at the unintended metaphor. "That's a good idea," he said quietly. "Strong walls are important." As they worked, a group of kids began to gather around, intrigued by the sight of an adult in the sandbox. One of them, a mischievous boy with a gap-toothed grin, pointed at Finn and said, "Are you Felix's dad for real?" Felix hesitated, glancing at Finn as if seeking confirmation. Finn met his gaze and nodded. "Yeah," he said. "I am." Felix's face lit up, and he turned to the other boy. "See? I told you I had a dad." The boy raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Well, he doesn't look like a castle builder to me." Felix giggled, and Finn couldn't help but laugh, the sound foreign but welcome in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, if only for a fleeting moment. As the afternoon wore on, Felix's confidence grew, and he began instructing the other children on how to improve their sandcastles. Finn found himself at the center of their impromptu workshop, surrounded by buckets, shovels, and the sound of laughter. It was chaotic but oddly grounding, a far cry from the polished boardrooms and high-stakes negotiations that had consumed his life for years. Felix leaned closer to Finn, his voice conspiratorial. "You're pretty good at this," he said, patting a wall of sand they had just finished together. "Mama doesn't like getting her hands dirty, so she doesn't help much." Finn chuckled softly. "Well, I don't mind getting my hands dirty if it means we get to build something cool, he said, wiping sand off his palms. His heart ached at the casual mention of Lisa, the reminder of how much she had done for their children while he'd been absent. Across the playground, Lisa stood behind a cluster of parents, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the scene unfold. She had come to pick up Felix, only to find him happily chatting with Finn, his small face lit up with joy. The sight sent a jolt of emotion through her, a mix of relief, anger, and something unnameable. Rachel appeared at her side, her gaze following Lisa's. "Looks like someone's making progress," she said lightly. Lisa shot her a glare. "He's playing in the sand, Rachel. That doesn't erase years of silence." "No, it doesn't," Rachel agreed. "But it's a start." Lisa shook her head, her grip on her emotions tightening. "Felix doesn't know what it's like to be let down by him," she said. "But I do, and I'm not going to let him get hurt." Rachel sighed, placing a hand on Lisa's shoulder. "I get it," she said softly, "but maybe give him the chance to prove he's serious. For Felix's sake, if nothing else." Lisa didn't respond, her eyes fixed on Finn as he carefully placed a small flag, a leaf stuck into the top of a stick, on the tallest sandcastle tower. Felix clapped his hands in delight, and Lisa's heart squeezed painfully. She turned away, unable to watch any longer. Back in the sandbox, Felix tugged at Finn's sleeve. "Can we build another one?" he asked eagerly. Finn smiled, brushing sand off his knees. "How about we take a break first?" he suggested. "I'd love to hear more about what you like to do." Felix's eyes lit up. "I like drawing. Anna does too. She's really good at it." "Anna," Finn repeated softly, his stomach tightening. He hadn't seen his daughter yet, but the thought of her filled him with both anticipation and dread. "What kinds of things does she draw?" Felix launched into an excited explanation about his sister's art, his small hands gesturing animatedly. Finn listened intently, soaking in every detail. For the first time in years, he felt like he was getting to know his family again, piece by piece, moment by moment. When it was time to leave, Lisa approached the sandbox, her expression guarded. "Felix, time to go," she called out, her tone firm but not unkind. Felix looked up, disappointment flashing across his face. "But we're not done," he protested. Lisa gave him a small smile. "You can finish next time," she said, her gaze flicking briefly to Finn before returning to Felix. "Let's go." Felix hesitated, then turned to Finn. "Will you be here next time?" Finn crouched to meet his son's eyes, his voice steady but earnest. "If your mom says it's okay, I'd like that," he said. Felix grinned, satisfied with the answer. He grabbed his bucket and shovel, then ran to Lisa, chattering about the sandcastle as they walked away. Finn watched them go, his chest heavy with the weight of what he'd gained and what he still had to fight for. He wasn't sure if Lisa would ever let him back into their lives completely, but seeing the spark of joy in Felix's eyes had given him something he hadn't felt in years: hope. As Lisa and Felix disappeared down the street, Finn stayed behind for a moment longer, staring at the empty sandbox. He knew the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, he felt like he had taken the first step in the right direction. The storm outside mirrored Lisa's inner turmoil as she sat on the worn couch in her small apartment. Rain tapped against the windows in an uneven rhythm, filling the quiet space with its steady cadence. Felix was fast asleep in the room he shared with Anna, his soft snores barely audible over the muffled sound of the wind. Anna was curled up in the corner of the couch, her sketchpad balanced on her knees, the glow of a nearby lamp illuminating her focused expression. Lisa watched her daughter with a mixture of pride and sadness. Anna was so much like her, creative, determined, and fiercely independent. But she had also inherited something Lisa wished she could have shielded her from, the weight of responsibility far beyond her years. "What are you drawing?" Lisa asked softly, breaking the silence. Anna glanced up, her eyes thoughtful. "It's a castle," she said, holding up the sketch. The drawing was detailed and intricate, with towering spires and winding staircases. "Felix wanted me to draw one like the one he and—" She hesitated, biting her lip before continuing. "Like the one he built today." Lisa's chest tightened at the mention of Finn. She took the sketchpad gently, studying the castle's sharp lines and delicate shading. "It's beautiful," she said, running her fingers lightly over the paper. "You're so talented, Anna." Anna shrugged, but the corners of her mouth lifted in a small, shy smile. She tucked her hair behind her ear and picked up her pencil again, her focus returning to the page. Lisa leaned back against the couch, her mind drifting. The afternoon's events had left her feeling raw and unsettled. Seeing Finn with Felix at the playground had stirred up emotions she thought she'd buried long ago. It wasn't just anger or hurt, it was fear. Fear of letting him back in, only to watch him walk away again. She closed her eyes, the sound of the rain growing louder in her ears. Images from their past flickered in her mind like an old film reel. Finn standing at the altar, his eyes filled with promises she'd believed with all her heart. Late nights in their first apartment, dreaming of a future together. The look on his face when she told him she couldn't stay anymore. Lisa exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if to banish the memories. She couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when the present demanded so much from her. Her children needed her to be strong, to protect them from the kind of pain she'd endured. Letting Finn back into their lives felt like a gamble she couldn't afford to take. "Mom!" Anna's voice pulled her back to the present. Lisa opened her eyes to find her daughter watching her with a curious expression. "Are you okay?" Lisa forced a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she said. "Just tired." Anna didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. She set her sketchpad aside and stood, stretching her arms. "I'm going to check on Felix," she said before disappearing into the bedroom. Lisa stared at the empty space where Anna had been, her thoughts swirling. The truth was, she wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine in years, but she couldn't let her children see that. They depended on her to hold everything together, even when it felt like the pieces were slipping through her fingers. The rain continued to fall as Lisa stood and walked to the window. She rested her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the surface. Somewhere out there, Finn was trying to find his way back into their lives. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if, maybe, she should let him. The rain softened into a gentle drizzle by the time Lisa turned away from the window, her thoughts still tangled in the possibility of Finn's return. She paced the small living room, the weight of her emotions making her restless. Every instinct told her to guard her heart, to protect the fragile stability she'd built for Anna and Felix. But a small, insistent voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, Finn deserved the chance to prove himself. She was startled from her thoughts by a soft knock on the door. Lisa hesitated, her pulse quickening. It was late, and visitors at this hour were rare. She glanced toward the children's bedroom, where the faint glow of Anna's nightlight seeped through the doorframe, then approached the front door cautiously. When she opened it, she was met with the familiar figure of Rachel, her umbrella dripping onto the welcome mat. "I know it's late," Rachel said with an apologetic smile, "but I wanted to check on you." Lisa stepped aside, letting her friend in. Rachel closed her umbrella and set it by the door, shaking off the rain. "I figured you might need some company after today," she said, her tone gentle but probing. Lisa sighed and sank onto the couch, gesturing for Rachel to sit beside her. "I'm fine," she said automatically, though the words felt hollow. "Just a lot on my mind." "Finn?" Rachel said knowingly, taking the seat next to her. Lisa nodded, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "He shows up out of nowhere, acting like he can just step back into our lives. It's not that simple." Rachel leaned back, crossing her arms. "No, it's not," she agreed. "But he didn't just show up to cause trouble, Lisa. I saw him with Felix today. He's trying." Lisa's eyes filled with uncertainty. What if he hurts them? What if he leaves again? I can't take that risk. Rachel placed a hand on Lisa's arm, her voice steady. "I get it. You've been carrying the weight of this family for a long time, and you're scared to let someone else take even a piece of it. But maybe this is his way of trying to carry some of it too." Lisa looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. She wanted to believe Rachel's words, but trust wasn't something she could give easily anymore. "I don't know if I can trust him," she said softly. Rachel squeezed her arm gently. "Then don't trust him yet," she said. "But give him the chance to earn it, for Felix, for Anna, and maybe for yourself too." The words lingered in the air long after Rachel left, the apartment silent except for the occasional drip of water from the umbrella near the door. Lisa sat in the quiet, her heart heavy with indecision. She glanced toward the children's room, where Felix's soft snores and Anna's steady breathing filled the space with a sense of calm. For their sake, Lisa thought, maybe she could let her guard down, just enough to see if Finn truly meant what he said. She didn't owe him anything, but she owed them everything. If there was even a chance he could be the father they deserved, wasn't it worth taking the risk? The rain had stopped entirely by the time Lisa made her way to bed, the storm outside replaced by a fragile stillness. Yet, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she realized the storm inside her had only just begun. The late morning sun peeked through scattered clouds, casting a soft glow over the sprawling green expanse of Audubon Park. Felix darted ahead, his small figure weaving through clusters of families and joggers. Lisa trailed a few steps behind, her gaze flicking between her son and the man walking beside her. Finn carried a small picnic bag, his movements deliberately unhurried, as if sensing her lingering unease. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Lisa asked, her voice low. She kept her hands firmly in her jacket pockets, as though shielding herself from the vulnerability of the moment. "It's a start," Finn replied evenly. "I'm not expecting miracles, Lisa. I just want to spend time with them." Lisa didn't respond, her jaw tightening. Ahead of them, Felix stopped near a shaded patch of grass, waving them over enthusiastically. "Come on, Mama. Let's sit here." Finn set the bag down and began unpacking its contents. Sandwiches, juice boxes, and a small container of cookies. Felix plopped down beside him, already reaching for a juice box. Lisa remained standing for a moment, her arms crossed as she watched the two interact. "Here," Finn said, holding out a sandwich toward her. His tone was casual, but there was a note of hopefulness in his eyes. Lisa hesitated before sitting down and accepting the sandwich, her movements careful and guarded. As they ate, Felix's chatter filled the space between them. He talked about school, his favorite cartoons, and a recent project Anna had been working on. Finn listened intently, asking questions and nodding along, his focus completely on his son. "And then Anna said she's going to draw me as a superhero," Felix exclaimed, his hands flying as he described the design. "She said I'll have a cape and everything." Finn chuckled, his eyes softening. "A superhero, huh? Sounds like she knows you pretty well." "Yeah," Felix said, grinning. "Anna's the best." Lisa glanced at Finn out of the corner of her eye, catching the subtle flicker of emotion that crossed his face at the mention of Anna. He hadn't seen her yet, and the distance between them was palpable. It was clear he was waiting for a moment for an opening, but Lisa wasn't sure when or if she could let that happen. Felix finished his sandwich and leapt to his feet. "Can we play tag now?" he asked, his energy seemingly endless. Finn smiled, setting his plate aside. "Sure," he said, standing and brushing off his hands. "You're it." Felix squealed with delight as Finn tapped his shoulder and jogged a few steps away. Lisa watched them, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. For the first time in years, she saw something that resembled a family, but the image felt fragile, as though it might shatter if she looked too closely. Felix's laughter echoed across the park as he chased Finn, his small legs pumping furiously. Finn let him get close, feigning exhaustion before darting away with a grin. The boy's determination to catch him was matched only by his joy, and Lisa couldn't help the small smile tugging at her lips as she watched. Eventually, Finn let Felix tackle him, falling onto the grass with a dramatic flourish. "You got me!" he exclaimed, holding his hands up in surrender. Felix giggled triumphantly, clambering onto Finn's chest as though securing his victory. Lisa stood and approached them, brushing stray grass off her jeans. "All right, superhero," she said to Felix, her voice light but firm. "Time to cool down before you overheat." "Okay, Mama," Felix said, still breathless from excitement. He climbed off Finn and ran to the picnic blanket, reaching for a cookie. Finn sat up, brushing grass off his shirt. "He's got a lot of energy," he said, looking up at Lisa. "Takes after you, I think." Lisa raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. She sat back on the blanket beside Felix, watching him devour his snack. Finn joined them a moment later, the easy camaraderie of the moment slowly settling over them. After a beat of silence, Finn glanced at Lisa. "How's Anna?" he asked softly, his voice careful. Lisa stiffened slightly, but didn't look at him. "She's fine," she said shortly, her tone making it clear she didn't want to elaborate. Finn nodded, not pushing further. Instead, he turned to Felix. "Do you think Anna would like to come next time?" he asked. Felix looked up, his mouth full of cookie. "Maybe," he said with a shrug. "She likes drawing more than playing outside." Finn smiled faintly, though there was a flicker of pain in his eyes. "Well, if she does, I'd love to see her." Lisa stayed quiet, her thoughts tangled. She couldn't deny that Felix was happier today than she'd seen him in a long time, but letting Finn inch closer to Anna felt like stepping onto uncertain ground. The walls she'd built to protect her children and herself weren't ready to come down just yet. As they packed up the picnic, Felix clung to Finn's hand, chattering non-stop about their next adventure. Lisa walked a few paces behind them, her arms crossed and her mind racing. She didn't trust Finn fully, but seeing the bond forming between him and Felix made her wonder, could there be room for reconciliation, even if just for their kids? For now, she decided, the answer would have to wait. The air inside the shelter's meeting room was warm and slightly stifling, filled with the hum of quiet conversations and the shuffle of papers. Lisa sat near the back of the small, crowded space, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The chairs around her were occupied by other parents and volunteers, all gathered for the monthly planning meeting. At the front of the room, Rachel stood behind a makeshift podium, her voice carrying a tone of both authority and encouragement as she discussed updates on shelter programs. Finn was seated closer to the front, his posture unusually relaxed as he listened intently to Rachel's words. Lisa's gaze kept drifting toward him despite herself. He looked completely at ease, as though he belonged in this space, but she knew better. He was trying, she'd give him that. But it was still strange seeing him here, so immersed in a world that felt so far removed from his polished corporate life. "And now, I'd like to introduce someone who has an idea for a new program," Rachel said, breaking Lisa's thoughts. "Finn Calloway has been volunteering with us recently, and he's proposed something that I think could make a big impact." "Finn?" The room fell quiet as Finn rose from his seat, the chair scraping softly against the floor. He straightened his shoulders, slipping into the practiced ease of a man used to speaking to crowds. For a brief moment, his eyes scanned the room before landing on Lisa. She looked away quickly, her stomach twisting with unease. "Thank you, Rachel," Finn began, his voice steady but not overly formal. "First, I just want to say how much I've come to admire the work this shelter does. It's clear that this place is more than just a building. It's a lifeline for so many families. That's why I'd like to help expand its reach." He paused, glancing at the faces around him. "I've been fortunate in my career, but I know that not everyone has the same opportunities. That's why I'm proposing a scholarship program, not just for education, but for skill training and mentorship. The goal would be to empower parents and young adults to build sustainable futures for their families." Murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly. It was an ambitious idea, and she couldn't deny that it had potential. But was this just another attempt for Finn to prove himself, to play the hero? Finn continued, "I know there are logistical challenges, and this isn't something that can happen overnight. But I'm committed to making it work, and I'm willing to put in the time, resources, and energy to see it through." When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Rachel spoke up. "Thank you, Finn," she said. "Does anyone have questions or thoughts they'd like to share?" Lisa's heart pounded as a few hands went up around the room. She stayed silent, though her mind raced with conflicting thoughts. She could see the interest in some of the other parents' eyes, but she wasn't ready to trust Finn's intentions. Not yet. The first question came from Jordan, a young volunteer who'd been with the shelter for years. His voice carried both curiosity and a hint of caution. "Finn, it's a great idea, but programs like this need more than just funding. How do you plan to ensure it's sustainable? And what's your role beyond just writing checks?" Finn nodded, seeming to appreciate the directness of the question. "You're absolutely right, Jordan. Throwing money at something isn't enough. That's why I want this program to involve mentorship. I'm reaching out to professionals in different industries who can commit their time to guide participants. It's about building skills and networks, not just providing resources." A few heads around the room nodded in approval, though Lisa noticed Rachel's measured expression. She wasn't one to be easily impressed, and it was clear she was waiting to see more than just words. Another parent raised her hand, her voice hesitant. "I think it sounds great in theory, but how do we know this isn't just temporary? A lot of us have seen programs start strong and then fall apart." Finn's jaw tightened slightly, but his response was calm. "I understand that concern. That's why I'm not doing this alone. The program will be overseen by a committee made up of people from this community, people who know the challenges firsthand. This will be a collaborative effort, not something imposed from the outside." Lisa felt her chest tighten as she listened. Finn was saying all the right things, but it only deepened her unease. How could she tell if this was genuine or another fleeting attempt to fix the past without fully understanding it? Rachel finally spoke, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "It's an ambitious proposal, Finn, and I appreciate the thought you've put into it. But these things take time to build. Are you ready for that kind of commitment?" Finn met her gaze without hesitation. "I am," he said firmly. "This isn't about me. It's about creating something lasting for families who need it. I'll do whatever it takes to make that happen." Rachel studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll discuss this further with the board, and decide on the next steps. But I'll say this: actions speak louder than words. If you want to be taken seriously, you'll have to show us you're here for the long haul. The meeting moved on to other topics, but Lisa's thoughts remained stuck on Finn's proposal. As the room emptied, she found herself lingering, watching as Finn chatted with a few parents and volunteers. There was an ease in his demeanor, a sincerity she hadn't expected. But trust wasn't something she could give lightly, not when the stakes involved her children. Rachel approached her, breaking her reverie. "What do you think?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. Lisa hesitated, glancing toward Finn. "I think he's trying," she admitted. "But trying doesn't mean much if he doesn't follow through." Rachel gave her a small smile. "Fair point, but maybe give him the chance to follow through. You don't have to trust him all at once, just enough to see what he does next." Lisa nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. Watching Finn interact with the shelter community, she couldn't shake the feeling that he might actually mean it. But letting herself believe, that felt like the riskiest choice of all. For now, she resolved to keep her walls up, at least until Finn's actions proved stronger than his words. The shelter was quieter than usual that morning, with only a handful of volunteers organizing supplies and preparing meals. Lisa stood in the kitchen, methodically sorting cans of food while her thoughts churned. It had been a week since Finn's presentation about the scholarship program, and the shelter was still buzzing with discussions about it. Some parents were excited by the prospect, hopeful that it might open doors they'd long believed closed. Others, like Lisa, were more reserved, uncertain of Finn's true intentions. She hadn't voiced her concerns publicly, but Rachel had noticed her unease. "It's okay to feel conflicted," Rachel had told her after the meeting. "Just because it's a good idea doesn't mean you have to trust him completely. But maybe it's worth giving him a chance." Lisa wasn't so sure. Trust was a fragile thing, and Finn had shattered hers long ago. Still, watching him interact with Felix and the other kids had stirred something in her, a flicker of hope she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The sound of hurried footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. One of the younger volunteers, Jordan, burst into the kitchen, his face pale and anxious. "Lisa," he said, his voice shaking. "It's Felix. He fell outside. He's hurt." Lisa's heart stopped. She dropped the can she was holding and rushed past Jordan, her mind racing with fear. Outside, a small group had gathered near the playground. Finn was already there, kneeling beside Felix, who sat on the ground clutching his arm. His face was streaked with tears, and his cheeks were flushed. "What happened?" Lisa demanded, her voice tight as she knelt beside her son. "He tripped running after the ball," Finn explained, his tone calm but tinged with worry. "I think he landed wrong on his arm." Felix sniffled, looking up at Lisa with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Mama, it hurts," he whimpered. Lisa gently examined his arm, noting the swelling around his wrist. "We need to get him to the hospital," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll drive," Finn offered immediately, already helping Felix to his feet. Lisa hesitated, the instinct to refuse warring with the urgency of the situation. "Fine," she said finally, her voice clipped. "Let's go." Finn carried Felix to his car, Lisa close behind. The ride to the hospital was tense, the air filled with the quiet hum of the engine and Felix's occasional sniffles. Lisa sat in the back seat with her son, holding his uninjured hand tightly, while Finn navigated the unfamiliar streets. When they arrived at the emergency room, Finn parked quickly and rushed to help Lisa carry Felix inside. The nurses took over, whisking Felix away to be examined. Lisa watched him go, her heart heavy with worry and guilt. She hadn't protected him, hadn't been there to stop the fall. The thought was unbearable. Finn's voice broke through her thoughts. "He'll be okay, Lisa," he said softly, his eyes filled with reassurance. "Kids are resilient." Lisa glanced at him, her emotions raw. "I hope you're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The waiting room was a blur of muted colors and soft murmurs, punctuated by the occasional hum of a distant intercom. Lisa sat stiffly in one of the plastic chairs, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her, Finn leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them almost as heavy as the worry hanging in the air. It felt like an eternity before the nurse returned, a clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Langston?" she called, glancing between them. Lisa shot up from her seat, her pulse quickening. "Yes. Is Felix okay?" The nurse offered a reassuring smile. "He's going to be fine. It looks like a minor fracture in his wrist. We've already set the bone and put on a cast. He's resting now, and you'll be able to take him home soon." Lisa let out a shaky breath, relief washing over her. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The nurse nodded and gestured toward the hallway. "You can see him now, but only one at a time for now." Lisa turned to Finn, her expression softening slightly. "I'll go first," she said quietly. He nodded, stepping aside to let her pass. She entered the room to find Felix lying on a hospital bed, his arm encased in a bright blue cast. His eyes lit up when he saw her. "Mama," he said, his voice small but cheerful. "Look, they let me pick the color." Lisa's throat tightened as she sat beside him, brushing a hand gently over his curls. "It's a good choice," she said, forcing a smile. "You're so brave, Felix." Felix beamed, clearly proud of himself. "It only hurt a little," he said, holding up his cast like a badge of honor. "And the nurse gave me stickers." Lisa laughed softly, her earlier fear fading in the warmth of his smile. For a moment, everything felt okay again. A knock at the door broke the moment. Lisa turned to see Finn standing in the doorway, his expression tentative. "Can I come in?" he asked. Felix's face lit up. "Dad, look at my cast!" he called, waving him over. Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Come on in," she said, her tone more neutral than before. Finn stepped inside, his gaze softening as he approached the bed. "That's a pretty cool cast," he said, crouching beside Felix. "Blue's my favorite color too." Felix grinned, clearly enjoying the attention. "The nurse said I can get everyone to sign it," he said. "Will you sign it, Dad?" The word hit Lisa like a jolt, but she kept her expression steady. Finn, meanwhile, looked momentarily stunned before nodding. "Of course," he said. "I'd be honored." Felix held out a marker from his bedside table, and Finn carefully wrote his name in neat, bold letters. As he handed the marker back, he glanced at Lisa, his expression earnest. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said softly. Lisa didn't respond right away, but as she looked at Felix's beaming face, something in her heart shifted. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something real. The sound of jazz music drifted through the air, blending with the murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses. The shelter's fundraiser event was in full swing, held in the spacious courtyard of a historic New Orleans building. Strings of fairy lights crisscrossed above, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering. Families, volunteers and donors mingled at tables adorned with simple floral centerpieces, their laughter and chatter creating an atmosphere of hope and community. Lisa stood near the edge of the courtyard, her arms loosely crossed as she watched the scene unfold. Rachel was at the microphone, giving a heartfelt speech about the shelter's impact and thanking everyone for their support. Lisa admired her friend's poise and passion, even as her own thoughts lingered elsewhere. Her gaze found Finn across the courtyard. He was talking with a group of donors, his posture relaxed, but his attention focused. He had traded his usual sharp suit for a more casual blazer and open-collared shirt, blending in better with the laid-back elegance of the event. Lisa couldn't deny that he looked comfortable here, even genuine. She hated how much that unsettled her. "Mum!" Felix's voice cut through her thoughts as he came bounding toward her, his blue cast standing out against the crisp white shirt he was wearing for the event. "Look, Mr. Jordan signed my cast, and he drew a rocket ship." Lisa smiled despite herself, crouching down to admire the drawing. "That's pretty cool," she said, brushing a hand over Felix's curls. "You've got quite the collection going." Felix grinned, holding up his arm like a trophy. "Dad said he's going to draw something too. Can he, Mama?" Lisa's chest tightened at the question, but she kept her voice steady. "If you want him to, of course he can." Felix nodded eagerly and ran off toward the dessert table, leaving Lisa standing alone again. She straightened slowly, her eyes drifting back to Finn, who was now shaking hands with one of the donors. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced her way, his expression softening when their eyes met. Before she could look away, he made his way toward her, weaving through the crowd with ease. "Hey," he said when he reached her, his voice warm but tentative. "You okay?" Lisa nodded, though she avoided his eyes. "It's a nice event," she said, her tone neutral. "Rachel did a great job putting it together." "She really did," Finn agreed. He hesitated, then added, "You should be proud too. You've done so much for the shelter." Lisa finally looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any trace of insincerity. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about the people who need it." "I know," Finn said quietly. "But you've made a difference, Lisa. That's not something everyone can say." Lisa felt her defenses waver, but she quickly reinforced them. "Why are you here, Finn?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "Really?" Finn didn't flinch. He met her gaze directly, his expression open. "Because I want to be," he said simply. "Because I want to show you that I'm not the same man I was." Lisa's chest tightened at his words, but before she could respond, Rachel's voice rang out again, inviting everyone to enjoy the next part of the evening, a performance by a local jazz band. The moment between them dissolved into the sounds of applause and shifting chairs, leaving Lisa feeling more unsettled than ever. The jazz band began playing, their soulful melody washing over the courtyard and weaving into the warm hum of conversation. Lisa found herself retreating to a quieter corner, needing space to process the emotions swirling inside her. The rhythm of the music was soothing, but her thoughts were anything but. She glanced toward the stage, where Felix had joined a small group of kids dancing near the musicians. His carefree laughter carried through the air, bringing a soft smile to her lips. Despite everything, she was grateful for moments like this, moments when her children could simply be happy. Finn appeared beside her again, a glass of sparkling water in his hand. He offered it to her without a word, his presence calm and unobtrusive. Lisa hesitated but took it, nodding her thanks. They stood in silence for a moment, watching Felix and the other children twirl and stomp to the music. "He's got a lot of energy," Finn said finally, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Takes after you." Lisa huffed a quiet laugh. "He takes after both of us," she said, surprising herself with the admission. Finn glanced at her, something tender flickering in his eyes. "I see so much of you in them," he said softly. "Anna's determination, Felix's curiosity. They're amazing, Lisa." Lisa swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the glass in her hand. She wasn't used to hearing this side of Finn, the side that noticed, that cared. "They're strong," she said. "They had to be." Finn's expression grew somber, guilt etched into his features. I know I wasn't there when I should have been, he said, but I want to change that. I'm trying to change that. Lisa turned to him, her eyes searching his face. For a moment, she let herself wonder if he truly meant it, if the man standing before her now was capable of being the father and partner he had failed to be before, but the scars of the past were still too raw, too deep. Words are easy, Finn, she said quietly. It's actions that matter. I know, Finn replied, his voice steady. That's why I'm here. Not just tonight, but for as long as it takes. Before Lisa could respond, Felix ran up to them, his face flushed with excitement. Mama, Dad, did you see me dancing? He asked breathlessly. Lisa smiled, bending down to brush his hair back. You were amazing, sweetheart. Finn crouched beside them, his smile matching hers. You've got some moves, buddy, he said. Think you can teach me? Felix giggled, grabbing Finn's hand and pulling him toward the dance floor. Come on. Lisa watched them go, her heart caught between hope and hesitation. She wasn't ready to let her walls down completely, but seeing Felix's joy and Finn's unwavering determination made her wonder if it was time to take the first step. As the music swelled and Finn spun Felix around to the sound of laughter, Lisa found herself lingering at the edge of the dance floor, watching a scene that felt both unfamiliar and comforting. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to let Finn back into their lives, piece by fragile piece. The rain had started again, a light drizzle falling steadily as Lisa stood on the shelter's covered porch. The sound of raindrops hitting the metal roof created a rhythmic backdrop, blending with the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. She wrapped her arms around herself, staring out at the empty street, her mind a tangle of thoughts she couldn't seem to quiet. The fundraiser had ended hours ago, and the shelter was mostly quiet now, save for the faint murmurs of volunteers cleaning up inside. Lisa had stayed behind, unable to leave just yet, as though the weight of the night demanded reflection. Finn's words from earlier echoed in her mind. That's why I'm here. Not just tonight, but for as long as it takes. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way he had said them, with a conviction she hadn't heard from him in years. Lisa wanted to believe him, but believing meant opening herself up to the possibility of being hurt again, and she wasn't sure she could survive that, not after everything she'd fought to rebuild. The sound of footsteps behind her broke her reverie. She turned to see Finn approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, his expression hesitant but calm. I thought I'd find you here, he said softly. Lisa didn't respond right away, her gaze flicking back to the street. The kids are with Rachel, she said after a moment, her voice quiet. She offered to take them for the night. Finn nodded, stepping closer but keeping a respectful distance. That's good. They'll have fun with her. A heavy silence settled between them, filled only by the soft patter of rain. Finn seemed to be waiting, giving her space to speak if she wanted to. When she didn't, he leaned against the porch railing, his eyes scanning the street. I know I've said this before, Finn began, his voice steady but low, but I want you to know I mean it. I'm not here to make excuses or to expect forgiveness. I'm here because I want to do right by you and the kids, because it's what you all deserve. Lisa's chest tightened, her emotions swirling just beneath the surface. She turned to face him, her arms still crossed protectively. Do you have any idea how hard it was for me? She asked, her voice trembling with both anger and pain. Raising them alone, wondering if I was doing enough, if I was enough. Finn's face fell, the weight of her words landing like a physical blow. I know it was hard, he said, his voice laced with guilt, and I know I can never undo the hurt I caused. But I want to try, Lisa. I want to be better, for them and for you. Lisa looked at him, her walls threatening to crumble under the raw sincerity in his voice. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past weren't so easily erased. The rain grew heavier, creating a steady drumming on the porch roof as Lisa stood facing Finn. Her arms remained crossed, a barrier between herself and the flood of emotions his words had unleashed. She wanted to lash out, to demand why it had taken him so long to care. But deep down, a small voice reminded her that she wasn't the same woman who had left him all those years ago. She had built a life for herself and her children without him. Stronger, yes, but also lonelier. "You say you want to be better," Lisa began, her voice steady but sharp. "But being here now doesn't erase the years you were gone, Finn. It doesn't take away the nights I had to explain to Anna why her father missed her school play, or why Felix didn't even know you existed for so long." Finn flinched at her words, but he didn't look away. "You're right," he said after a moment. "It doesn't erase any of that, and I can't change the past, Lisa. But I'm here now because I don't want to miss anything else. I don't want to be the kind of father who's only a name to his kids." Lisa's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Words are easy, Finn," she said. "But actions, that's what matters. You don't just get to show up and expect us to trust you again." "I know," Finn said, his voice almost a whisper. "And I'm not asking for trust, not right away. I'm asking for a chance to earn it." Lisa turned back toward the rain, the cool mist carried by the wind brushing against her face. She could feel the sincerity in Finn's words, but her heart was still heavy with doubt. "You think you can just fix this?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Like it's some broken deal at your office?" "No," Finn said firmly, stepping closer but still keeping a respectful distance. "This isn't about fixing anything, Lisa. It's about showing up, about being there for the hard parts, not just the good ones." Lisa's breath hitched at his words, and for a moment she felt the weight of all the years she had carried alone. She turned to look at him again, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "If I let you try," she said slowly, "if I let you into their lives, into our lives, you can't walk away again. You can't disappear when it gets hard." Finn met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "I won't," he said. "I promise you, Lisa, I'm here to stay." The conviction in his voice shook something loose inside her. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. Lisa let out a slow breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. "We'll see," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not making any promises. You'll have to prove yourself." Finn nodded, a small flicker of hope lighting his expression. "I will," he said. The rain continued to fall as they stood there, the distance between them feeling a little less insurmountable than before. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step forward, and for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt like that might be enough. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Lisa's apartment, casting a warm glow over the small but neatly arranged living room. The soft hum of activity filled the air, Anna sketching at the dining table, her pencils scratching softly against the paper, while Felix carefully arranged plants in small terracotta pots by the windowsill. Lisa moved between them, her heart light, as she helped Felix sprinkle a handful of soil into one of the pots. "Don't forget the water, Mama," Felix said seriously, holding up a small watering can. "Plants need water to grow." Lisa smiled, brushing a smudge of dirt from his cheek. "Don't worry, we'll take care of them," she said. "They'll grow strong just like you." Felix grinned, turning his attention back to his plants. Anna glanced up from her sketch pad, watching the scene unfold with quiet amusement. "It's starting to look like a real garden in here," she remarked, gesturing toward the growing collection of pots lining the windowsill. Lisa stepped back to admire their work, a sense of pride swelling in her chest. "It's a good start," she said. Once the weather's nice, we can take them outside and make something even bigger. The sound of a knock at the door interrupted their moment. Lisa's smile faltered briefly, but she quickly composed herself. "I'll get it," she said, walking toward the door. When she opened it, Finn stood on the other side, holding a small, neatly wrapped box. He smiled hesitantly, his eyes flicking behind her to catch a glimpse of the children. "Morning," he said, his voice warm but careful. "Am I too early?" Lisa shook her head, stepping aside to let him in. "Not at all," she said. "We were just working on Felix's plants." Felix's face lit up when he saw Finn. "Dad, look at my garden," he called out, waving him over. Finn crouched beside Felix, examining the rows of pots with genuine interest. "This is impressive," he said, his tone full of admiration. "You've got a green thumb, buddy." Felix beamed at the compliment, and Anna watched from her seat, a small smile playing on her lips. "He's been talking about this all week," she said, glancing at Lisa. "It's his new favorite thing." Lisa met Anna's gaze, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She turned to Finn, her voice steady but kind. "We're going to take them outside soon, make a real garden. You're welcome to help if you want." Finn looked up at her, a hint of surprise softening his expression. "I'd like that," he said simply. Lisa nodded, her heart steady as she watched him interact with the children. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like the beginning of something whole. The afternoon sun was bright as the family stepped outside, their arms filled with pots and tools. They walked toward the small patch of grass behind the apartment complex, where Finn had already cleared a spot earlier that morning. Felix ran ahead carrying his favorite plant, while Anna trailed behind, her sketch pad tucked under one arm. Finn set down the tools and turned to Felix. "All right, little gardener, where should we start?" he asked, his tone playful. Felix pointed decisively to the center of the patch. "Right here," he declared, holding up his pot like a trophy. Lisa laughed softly, shaking her head. "Okay, let's start there," she said, kneeling beside Finn. Together, they helped Felix dig a small hole, carefully placing his plant in the ground. Anna watched them for a moment, before setting her sketch pad aside and joining in, her hands quickly covered in dirt. As they worked, the small garden began to take shape. A mixture of bright flowers, sturdy green plants, and a few whimsical decorations Felix had insisted on adding. Lisa glanced at Finn, who was focused on arranging the pots with Felix's input. There was something different about him now, a patience and gentleness that hadn't been there before. When the final plant was in place, Felix clapped his hands in delight. "It's perfect," he exclaimed, stepping back to admire their work. "It is," Anna agreed, brushing dirt from her hands. She glanced at Finn, her voice softer as she added, "You did a good job, Dad." Finn froze for a moment, surprised by her words. Then a smile spread across his face, and he nodded. "Thanks, Anna," he said, his voice steady. "That means a lot." Lisa watched the exchange, her heart swelling. She saw the way Finn looked at their children, with pride, love, and determination. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that he wasn't going to walk away again. As the sun began to set, they sat together on the edge of the garden, their work complete. Felix leaned against Lisa, his eyes growing heavy with sleep, while Anna sketched quietly beside them. Finn sat on Lisa's other side, his presence no longer feeling like an intrusion, but a part of something whole. Lisa let out a long breath, the weight of the past lifting ever so slightly. She wasn't ready to say everything was fixed, but for the first time she felt that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new together. And as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, the garden stood as a small but powerful symbol of hope, growth, and the promise of second chances.